the broad topic is the civil rights movement, but looking at it through the eyes of a child, me, born and raised in the Deep South immediately after the end of World War II. So it's a kind of coming of age story, if you will. But I can't simply start with my birth in Laura Bell Memorial Hospital in Tallahassee, which was a black-owned and operated hospital. And there were a number of black-owned and operated hospitals in the Deep South during the segregation era, partly because some public hospitals and some white-owned and operated hospitals did not take black patients, or if they took black patients, they did not allow admitting privileges for black physicians. Also, black physicians were not admitted to the local chapters of the American Medical Association, so that the National Organization of Black Physicians during the segregation era was not the American Medical Association, but initially the Negro Medical Association. And then when the Brown decision was rendered in 1954, which basically outlawed separate but equal, most of the black organizations, which bore the term Negro in their title, renamed themselves to National. So you had the American Medical Association, or the American Nurses Association, which were the predominantly white organizations that up through 1954 had excluded black physicians and black nurses. And then you have the National Medical Association, the National Bar Association, the National Nurses Association, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. But I can't start with my birth. I have to start with my parents. I won't go all the way back to my grandfather, who, on my father's side, who was born in the slavery era. We don't know much about him, or even whether he was born slave or free, but he was born in the 1850s. In the 1850s. So you're looking at the third generation removed from the slavery era, which is relatively rare for a person of my age because the generations are usually shorter. But I come from a long line of old men's children. According to my calculation, my grandfather on my father's side was in his mid-50s, not younger than his mid-50s, when he and my grandmother started having the first of the 7 children that they would have. And then my father was a late starter, not quite as late as his father. He was 37 years old when I was born. And continuing the tradition, I was 48 years old when my daughter was born. And she's now a 19-year-old, about to be 19-year-old sophomore at Northeastern. So the long line of old men's children. My parents were both born in 1910. Father in Pennsylvania, in the coal fields of western Pennsylvania, and my mother in Albemarle County, Virginia, where Charlottesville is located. I call it Thomas Jefferson's County. They did not know each other until they went to college. Going to college, as you can imagine, was not a routine thing for either side of my family. My father was the first, and as it turns out, the only one of his siblings to graduate from college. My mother was the second oldest of 13 children. She was the first to go to college, but not the only. They sort of established a pipeline at the place where she went to high school as a boarder, and then later to college at the same place. Okay, so there's basically two types of segregation. De jure segregation is prescribed by law. And in the Jim Crow states, it was fairly comprehensive. De facto segregation exists. It is a daily fact, but it's not necessarily prescribed by law. So my father was born and raised in Western Pennsylvania, where there were no laws in the state of Pennsylvania that required separate schools or separate eating facilities and such. But there was de facto segregation in his hometown, Uniontown, Pennsylvania, on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. There was no discrimination in housing, at least for poor people who lived in company housing owned by the H.C. Frick Coal and Coke Company. Frick was a lieutenant of Carnegie. So there was a white family, the McLeans on one side of the duplex, if you can call it that, and the Halls on the other. But in selected public accommodations, like restaurants, there were restaurants in Uniontown that did not serve black people. There were hotels in Uniontown that did not serve black people. There were some that did and some that didn't. The restaurant where my father happened to work as a night cleanup man during the Depression was one of those that did not serve Negroes. So he would not have been able to eat there, though he was able to work there. And then the large downtown hotel, and I did not learn this story until 5 or 6 years ago, before my Uncle Lawrence, who was from my dad's hometown and who married one of my mom's sisters, and who lived to be about 90. We were at a family reunion, or maybe Aunt Zola's funeral, some family event, and it came out that he was the first black to graduate from the Wharton School of Economics. And I grew up not knowing that. I knew he was an accountant. My father was also an accountant. And I'm kind of surprised that I did not hear about that. But that's the way it was. And then another part of the story that Uncle Lawrence told was that he got a job as an auditor for the state of Pennsylvania. And he was sent to his hometown with a team of state auditors. The rest of his team members stayed in the hotel, but he could not. Fortunately, he was in his hometown and he could stay with his parents. But it was the principle of the thing. Now, on my mother's side, Charlottesville was de jure segregated by law, schools, public accommodations, restrooms, water fountains, all of that. The one story that I would share has to do with education. My mother was homeschooled in a white family. And the head of the household was a professor of history, ironically, which is what I became, a professor of history at the University of Virginia, Professor Richard Dabney. And Richard Dabney's son, Virginius Dabney, was a longtime editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper. Apparently, Professor Dabney approached my grandfather, who was his gardener, and said, "You got a fine bunch of children there. Why don't you let me have one of them?" Professor Dabney had a daughter who was my mother's age. So my mother was a live-in childhood companion and baby maid for Alice Dabney. They did everything educational together. A retired New England school marm lived in the house and provided schooling. Alice had a slate with chalk. Mary Washington, my mother, had a slate with chalk, and they took their lessons together. And the professor had told them that when he was really speaking to Alice, when you get to the appropriate age, I'm going to teach you French. But the girls were innocent enough. They had done everything else educationally together, so they assumed that they would both be taught French by the professor. But when that time came, he declined to teach my mother French. He didn't believe in teaching Negroes French. What would they need it for? It would ruin a good maid. And at that point, she left the house, went back home, and entered public school for the first time at the equivalent of middle school. And she joined the same grade as her sister Margaret, who was a year older. But her public schooling career in Albemarle County, and that of every other black person, was over at 8th grade. 8th grade was as high as you could go if you were black. Now, in the development of public education, there were lots of jurisdictions that didn't have high schools at first. But whenever the jurisdiction had a high school, there was a high school for whites before there was a high school for blacks. And in fact, there was litigation, lawsuits conducted by the NAACP once it was founded, challenging counties for providing high school for whites with public funds and no high school for blacks with public funds. And the ground was, under the 14th Amendment, that was unequal protection of the laws. My mother went away to school. Her parents wanted her to get a college. Well, it wasn't college at that time. They wanted her to further her education. And there was an institution which later became an accredited college to which she could go. And that was Hampton Institute in Virginia. Many of you have probably heard of Hampton Institute, and if you haven't heard of Hampton, you've heard of Booker T. Washington, who was the founder of Tuskegee Institute. Well, Washington was a graduate of Hampton Institute. And there was in black higher education what was called the Hampton model, which was industrial education, normal school, which is high school, educate the Negroes hand and heart more so than his or her head. So the focus was industrial education. And there were debates among African Americans right about the time that my parents were born as to which kind of education was most appropriate for the Negro. Industrial or full-scale scientific and humanistic education. That is the best that was available at mainstream universities. Washington emphasized in the industrial model, and W.E.B. Du Bois, Massachusetts' own, emphasized what he called the talented 10%. This was not elitist in the social sense, but in the sense of talent. He believed that black folk who had the talent and the ability to learn should have access to the best available scientific, technical, and liberal arts education. And so they kind of disagreed about that. Washington sent his own kids to Fisk, which was a liberal arts place. So he didn't intend for it to apply to every last person. And similarly, it is not to be assumed that Du Bois denigrated or low-rated manual education. It was a matter of emphasis. And there was, in my opinion, enough work to be done that if Washington and his supporters were pushing from the bottom and Du Bois and his supporters were pulling from the top, that you might acquire some momentum to, as they used to say in those days, uplift the race. So my parents went to Hampton. That's where they met. My father came south to get a college education. His peers and his siblings teased him about going south. They thought that they were up north, where nobody cared, where race didn't matter, even though there were certain places they couldn't eat, certain places they couldn't stay. But it was not comprehensive legal across the board. And so they teased him about, why do you want to go down south? You're going to have to sit in the back of the bus and all of that. Well, he took it, and that was his main chance to get higher education. Most of the institutions of higher education for blacks were in the South, with a couple of exceptions, like Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, or Cheney in Pennsylvania, but most were in the South. Many of them on the Tuskegee and Hampton model in the private sector, and many of them on the land grant, agricultural, mechanical, agricultural, technical, practical, in the public sector, state. So that brings me to my birth, with one exception. And that is the war, World War II. World War II, as most of you know, in the Army was fought against Nazism and fascism and all of those isms with an abjectly racially segregated army. Abjectly segregated army. Black troops, white commanding officers. Most of the training places, especially those to which black troops were sent, were in the South. And the minute they stepped off base, they encountered problems in the local areas. Now, my dad was not in a combat unit. He was a master sergeant in the quartermaster corps, and it was in a headquarters detachment. So he did not actually participate in combat. And he told me that as close as he came to a physical confrontation with another human being during his military service overseas was in England with some white American soldiers who saw him dancing with a British woman at a dance hall, didn't like that, and were about to beat him to a pulp until some uniformed British military intervened and saved him from a beating. That was his experience in terms of the threat of physical confrontation, was with a fellow American. Even so, he was not bitter about that. He was matter of fact about that. He and most of his fellow black soldiers who fought in all black units were proud of their service. So after the war, he comes out, and within a year after mustering out, he gets a job in his field in which he was trained at Hampton, accounting. But the job was at a historically black college, one of those land grant colleges, state operated, Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University in Tallahassee, FAMU. It's been in the news lately for not particularly lovely things involving the hazing incident with the marching band. But I grew up as a campus brat, born in a black hospital, raised in the community surrounding the campus, and unlike some black youth of other social classes, I could not name another white child my age that I associated with growing up. I never set foot in a classroom with a white student, and I never set foot in a classroom with a white teacher from kindergarten through 8th grade. I completed 8th grade in 1961, and at that point, the schools were not desegregated. The public schools in Leon County, Florida, were not desegregated. And that's not unusual for that time. Very few public schools in the South were desegregated in 1961, though you can do the arithmetic for how many years that was after the Brown decision was rendered in 1954. And in fact, the school system in Tallahassee was not thoroughly desegregated until after I had gone away to boarding school in New Hampshire and remained in the North for college and returned home to go to graduate school at Florida State University. The first fall that I was in graduate school was the first fall that the school system was thoroughly desegregated in Tallahassee, Florida. And going away to St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire was, in a way, an extension of the civil rights movement, because one of the issues was access to quality education. And if you could not get it at home, there were some who would do what I call study abroad. you might call it a domestic study abroad. And I was the second black student to attend St. Paul's School. Interestingly enough, the first one was the son of the sitting president of Tuskegee Institute. He was, as a matter of fact, I don't know what to make of it, but he was lighter in complexion than I was, and you know, father as a college president, that's a good marker. And he was carefully selected. And I guess I was carefully selected in a way. I was a kind of first non-elite, highly visibly pigmented African-American student to enroll at St. Paul's School. And I have to tell a story on myself. There was a black Episcopal priest who was an activist in the Tallahassee bus boycott and the sit-ins and all of that, who was my priest, David H. Brooks. And in 1960, the Episcopal Church had their national confab, whatever it is, and it was in Honolulu that year. And the Episcopalians were wringing their hands and bemoaning how terrible it was that the way the Negroes were treated down south. And that's true, but a caucus of black Episcopal priests said, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but don't you have Episcopal affiliated exclusive boarding schools? And they said, oh, yes, now that you mention it, we do. And they said, well, do you have any colored students in those schools? Well, now that you mention it, we don't. Well, why do you think that is? So, well, we have very rigorous admission standards. How would a Southern Negro boy have ever heard of a New England boarding school? And the priests who had these missions scattered throughout the South, usually in towns that had historically black colleges, said, well, if you all are not jiving, we can see to it that some qualified Southern Negro students hear about the existence of these schools. And so a little kitty was created and it was managed by Reverend Sam Tarpley, who was in Voorhees, South Carolina, where Voorhees Technical Institute was located, one of the historically black colleges. And the black priests went home to identify a nominee. Put your best foot forward. We're going to put this to the test. And the money was to pay for the reproduction of the dossier. And so Father Brooks was trying to decide. He had 2 or 3 boys that he was trying to decide about who to nominate. And it had boiled down to me and Eddie Hollifield. Now, Eddie Hollifield came from a brilliant family. They lived about 5 blocks down the street from me. We were schoolmates, playmates. Eddie ended up going to Franklin and Marshall, getting a master's degree in economics at Penn, and then changing his field and going into internal medicine. And eventually went back home, and where he's practicing part-time in Tallahassee. His sister, Marilyn, went to Swarthmore and Harvard Law School. The oldest brother, Bishop, finished FAMU in 3.5 years and graduated from Harvard Law School the year that I graduated from Harvard College. So the Hollifields were not half-stepping, as we used to say. There was a fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Eloise J. Wright, who was never wrong, who had taught both of us. We had passed through Mrs. Wright. And so Father Brooks said, Eloise, I've got to nominate somebody, go to one of these fancy New England prep schools. And it's come down in my mind to Bobby Hall or Eddie Hollifield. Well, I don't know whether Father Brooks was aware, but Ms. Wright quickly made him aware that in fifth grade, Eddie Hollifield, who had a temper, had smacked Mrs. Wright in the face in front of the class. So I was in for the nomination, at least, mainly because I hadn't smacked any teachers around. And I had demonstrated that I could hold my temper. I was only involved in probably 2 fights in my life growing up. And one of them was with a notorious bad boy who just wouldn't leave me alone. He was a thief in more ways than one. He used to think when he went into a department store or hardware store, things disappeared, and he had, all kinds of compartments in his raincoat, etc. Then he was a Boy Scout, and he embezzled money he was a treasurer of the troop, and he embezzled money from his Boy Scout troop at Bethel AME Church. Now, I was at another troop, but he was hanging around our meetings, picking at me, trying to get a fight. Because we were the Hill Negroes. We were associated with FAMU. And there were people who didn't live on the Hill, people who lived in Smoky Hollow, who thought that we looked down on them. And so Leon Morris kept picking at me. And I wasn't woofing. I said, Leon, please stop. Please don't bother me because I don't want to have to hurt you. I was larger than him, more athletic than him, but he had the reputation of being the bad boy. So he didn't stop. And I picked him up and threw his behind in the bushes. And the word spread. Don't mess with Bobby Hall. That was the last fight I had. So being nonviolent in my daily life, except for on the football field, was what got me the nod for the nomination. So we gathered up all the material, and I'm an only child, born late to my parents, and my parents saved every scrap. The program from the 6th grade Christmas play and the souvenir program from nursery school graduation. Because we, in the academic setting, we had cap and gown in nursery school and every place along the line. And they boxed all that stuff up, sent it to Sam Tarpley. He reproduced it, sent it to 6 Episcopal Church affiliated boarding schools. And after that, it was in their hands. They could decide whether or not they would respond, whether or not they would send us an application, move to the next step. Only one of the 6 schools responded. Probably the other ones were put off by the sheer volume of the dossier. But St. Paul's saw something in there, and they invited me to apply by sending me the application form. And they also sent the form to apply for the admissions test. And this was very close to the deadline for the admission test. And we had had no contact with the school. We were literalists. You know, you read the directions and you follow the directions. So the application for the exam says, an application to sit for the examination does not constitute an application to the school. You should already have applied to the school by the time you apply for the examination. So as the deadline for applying for the exam approached, I sat down, pulled an all-nighter, and scrambled up my essay and got my application in to the school, because an application for the exam does not constitute an application to the school. And you should already have applied to the school before you apply for the exam. So we did that. And then when it was time to take the exam, then the question was, where will the exam be administered? There were 2 white kids in Tallahassee that were applying to some Episcopal boarding school in Atlanta. And they were supposed to take the test too. But folk didn't want it to get out that blacks and whites were doing things together in an educational context. So there was this remote building called the Leon County Educational Materials Center. That's where they stored the textbooks. And they cleared off a table in a back room and sat us down and administered the exam. That was really the first time I had a conversation with a white kid my age. And, you know, there could have been trepidation when groups that are not in contact with each other. Are they better than us? Are they smarter than us? That kind of thing. But after, and this may sound egotistical on my part, but after I had conversation with these 2 guys, I figured I didn't have anything to worry about. I later discovered that it's a very common cross-cultural occurrence for members of one group to perceive members of another group of the same age as being immature. When I lived in France for a summer with a French family, the Americans in my group perceived French kids our age to be immature because they sat around and they played parlor games. You know, Pierre, appelle Paul, clap, clap. That was, people sang songs, amuse themselves. Well, French kids our age considered us to be immature because we couldn't do without Coca-Cola and hair curlers and our gadgets. They said, you Americans are too dependent on your gadgets. Now, we saw it different because nobody likes gadgets more than the French. But it's, so you have a gadget to have one. It's almost like a piece of furniture, but we're not dependent on it. But in any case, I later came to perceive that as a common cross-cultural perception. But at that point, it was very comforting to me to know that, you know, I was up to the competition. So we just only applied to one school, which, looking back on it, was crazy if I really wanted to go away, but I didn't necessarily really want to go away. I wasn't told from day one, if you make straight A's, if you do well, we'll send you off to a boarding school. Now, I had peers growing up in the college-related community whose parents did do that. I had peers whose parents gave them $5 for every A they got on their report card. Getting straight A's was out of the question for me because in grade school, we got graded in handwriting. And so I didn't have to sweat getting straight A's because I knew I was never going to get them. The pressure was off. The only time I got A in handwriting was when we had a practice teacher. And I think I got that. I did a little work on my handwriting, but I think I got that mostly by carrying her books around. So the pressure was off. You know, all the third of the class was as smart as I was, or better, in terms of grades. So we wait and we wait and we wait. Then we get a phone call in the spring from the admissions director saying, we believe we'd like to offer Bob a place in the form of 1965. And we get this much financial aid and so on and so forth. So I went. So that's the educational path. I went through all that, went through 4 years of college, and it came back home. Public schools were still segregated. Public schools are still segregated. Marilyn Hollifield, who stayed at home through high school, was one of the first 3 black students to attend the premier, the oldest premier, previously all-white high school in Leon County. She and another nursery school mate of mine enrolled in the fall of 1963 at Leon High School. The first black students to enroll at Florida State University also enrolled in the fall of 1963. 6 people. But I knew almost all of them. Almost all of them were from Tallahassee. And one of them, Carmina Green, had been my babysitter. So, and when I came back to attend Florida State University in 1969, there were still no black faculty members there. So that's the educational story. Now, the other, for me, has to do with the 2 other things. One is traveling under Jim Crow in the segregated South. And the other is the Tallahassee bus boycott, which was a formative experience for me and for people my age. It was the second bus boycott after Montgomery. It's less well known, but it was the second. And there's a link between Montgomery and Tallahassee in that one of the leaders of the boycott in Tallahassee, a Baptist minister, the Reverend C.K. Steele, whose church I had attended before I became an Episcopalian and went to Father Brooks's church. So in terms of civil rights orientation, which is not to say that all ministers were civil rights oriented, probably most were not, but for me, making that shift, becoming what I jokingly call a Baptopalian, it was out of the frying pan into the fire in terms of the activist orientation of my ministers. But the Reverend C.K. Steele, who was a pastor at Bethel Baptist Church, one of the oldest black Baptist churches in Tallahassee, founded in the 1860s, shortly after the end of the Civil War. He and Martin Luther King Jr. were roommates at Morehouse College. And Steele had married a woman from Montgomery. And Ralph Abernathy, who was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s sort of right-hand people, was a close buddy of Steele as well. And so C.K. Steele often ran into conflict with his board of deacons and his congregation because he kept a bag packed. And whenever Martin Luther King Jr. or one of his lieutenants called, it would say, "CK, get on the next bus to Albany, Georgia. We're going to jail. Get on the next bus to Birmingham. We're going to jail." Now, the congregation and the deacons in particular weren't too happy about that because they said, "We didn't hire you to be going on these protests and getting yourself put in jail. We hired you to preach the sermon. We hired you to visit the sick and the shut-in." So there were tensions within these congregations. So the boycott. Most of the people who rode the buses were African American. And most of the African Americans who rode the buses were women who were domestic workers. They used to refer to the buses, certain lines, as the Workers' Express. It would go through the poorest black neighborhoods where the streets were not paved and pick up the domestic workers and carry them around to what we used to call Country Club Row and drop them off. And then at the end of the day, it would come back around and bring them back home to Bond Subdivision or some other place. And even though we lived near the university and many of the people on my street were educated and affiliated with the university, for at least half of my childhood, our street was not paved. And we had open drainage ditches. So when the boycott came, the city fathers and the operators of the bus company, initially they said, "We don't need your business. Go ahead and boycott." And that, first of all, it's a bad business decision because, if a boycott was 75% effective and, 80% of the riders are black, you going to go in the red real soon. And ultimately, the transit company, which was private but operating the system for the city, they shifted sides in the litigation and ultimately joined the protesters, seeking an injunction against enforcing the segregation ordinance because they were going out of business. But in the meantime, just a kid, I really took that personally. And I vowed as a kid under 10 years old that, doggone it, I'm never going to ride one of these buses again in my life. And I managed to go through life till I went back to graduate school in 1969. And even then, where I lived was near Florida A&M, which was on one of Tallahassee's 7 hills. And Florida State University was clean on the other side of the railroad tracks on another one of Tallahassee's 7 hills. And I walked to graduate school for class every day rather than to ride the bus. But one day, I was running a little late, and I just happened to get to a certain corner where there was a bus stop and where the bus was there and the door was open. So there I was, frozen momentarily in a moral dilemma from the point of view of a little kid. And then, the rational part took over, and I said, I'm going to be late if I don't get on this bus. So I got on the bus, and I went and sat in the back of the bus, not because we had to. And when I sat down, I broke down crying because it's a childish thing, but I had vowed that I was not going to ride those damn buses again in my life. Now, people of other social classes, black folk of other social classes who lived on the other side of town and who had to take the bus to go to school, they couldn't afford to hold on to that for, decades. So that there were class differences, and I dare say that the people affiliated with the university were more isolated from whites, partly voluntarily, so as to minimize these negative encounters. See, we didn't work in white people's homes like most of the rest of the town. We didn't work in the factories. We weren't yard men, although there were some yard men who worked at campus. But within the campus, you could not predict where someone was in the organizational hierarchy or the occupational hierarchy merely by seeing that they had a black face. The president was black, the chief accountant was black, Mr. Johnny Norman, who used cast-off shoes that were too small, and he would cut the toe out, and he was a maintenance man whose job was to take a sawed-off broomstick with a nail in it and go around picking up chewing gum wrappers and other kind of trash on the grounds. But you couldn't tell merely by knowing that the person was black or by seeing the person's face. And if you saw Mr. Johnny Norman in church on Sunday, in his Sunday best, you would not necessarily know that he wasn't the president of Florida A&M University. So that's the bus boycott thing. Now, the last and final, before I open up for questions, is traveling in the Jim Crow South. My family, my household, was very far removed from the nearest aunt or uncle. The nearest aunt was my mother's sister, Jane, who lived in Whitakers, North Carolina, which was 565 miles door to door from where we lived. And my dad was very precise about numbers and all of that kind of stuff. And so the challenge was, where are you going to eat? If you don't make the kind of progress that you've calculated you're going to make, if you don't average 50 miles an hour, if you get tired, where can you stay? And where can you go to the bathroom? Now, we packed, as my mother put it, everything but the kitchen sink. We packed rolls of toilet paper, and we packed shoe boxes full of fried chicken. Same thing when you travel on the train in a coach class, because you never knew where you were going to be able to go to the bathroom. You might have to stop on the roadside, as the jazz singer Billie Holiday had to do in the 30s and 40s. And one of the times that she stopped on the roadside, went out into the woods, and she looked up and she saw a black man hanging from a tree who had been lynched. And it was that experience that inspired her to write the song called Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit. Well, we never had that kind of encounter, but there were times when my mother couldn't find anywhere else to go to the bathroom, and my father and I had to stand guard, on the roadside. Or if you could find a place to go, you might be directed to an open jail cell that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in 50 years in the city jail or in town hall or something like that. So it was fortunate that my parents had college classmates scattered all over the South. And so we would sit down before we planned our itinerary and say, well, now, Dad would say, Mommy, who do we know in Columbia, South Carolina? Isn't Clarence Hollis an insurance man in Columbia? So they would write Clarence Hollis, give him our itinerary, say, we think we're going to be arriving in your place at about such and such a time. Can we stay with you? Then many business people, particularly pharmacists who ran drugstores and soda fountains, would keep a room as a kind of guest room above the pharmacy in case there were travelers. And then there was a book that was published called the Green Book, published by a black man named Mr. Green, as it turns out, it was a little kind of the AAA guide for blacks. I guess if it was the AAA, then this would be the NAA, the Negro Automobile Association equivalent. And so we would look those things up. And so to sum it up, as a homegirl of mine who later became a film producer and radio producer for National Public Radio, she did a program about traveling in the segregated South, and she entitled it Ain't No Bed of Roses. And the way she put it together was that she called some people of her father's generation to talk about travel. And then I lived in D.C. at the time, and she lived in D.C., and she picked up the phone. She called me, said, Bobby, I'm doing this special on such and such, and I know that you all traveled a lot, so you're going to be home this morning or tomorrow morning? I said, yeah. So she came to my living room in Washington, D.C., put up her equipment, and recorded some conversation. And that ended up on the special, and it won a prize. So those are some of the experiences. And then if you want to talk about law and marriage, for example, as late as 1967, when I was sophomore or junior in college, there were still 13 states in the United States where interracial marriage was illegal. One of those states being my home state of Florida, and the other one being my mother's home state of Virginia. And the case that got those last 13, wiped off the books and declared unconstitutional was entitled, ironically, Loving versus the state of Virginia. And in this case, the couple was a black woman and a white man. And Virginia said that if you want to get married, you must leave the state. And both of them had grown up in Virginia, and they wanted to live in Virginia. Their family was in Virginia, and so they filed this lawsuit. So I'm just telling some stories, somewhat meandering stories, but I hope I've hit some highlights. One would be the educational theme. One would be the public accommodations and the traveling theme, and another would be protests, such as boycotts, sit-ins, wade-ins, swim-ins, because some of these cities, including Tallahassee, would sooner shut down all of the public swimming pools than to admit black students and citizens to the white swimming pools. They would sooner shut down the municipal golf course than to allow blacks to play. Now, some jurisdictions built separate courses for blacks. It might be a 9-hole course, whereas the other municipal course was an 18-hole course. Some cities, including Tallahassee, would do things like shut down the municipal golf course and then lease it for $1 a year to the country club or to the country club set. So those are some of the themes. And when I tell my daughter these things, she finds it difficult to believe that anything like this ever happened in the United States of America.